Hello, and welcome back to Horn Sessions. This is part 2 of our 4th interview with Erik Ralske. Erik, what is your primary objective when you teach?
Well, every student has dreams about where they want to be, short-term or long-term, their ultimate dreams, what they want to do professionally. So, my job is to help them achieve those dreams. And I think the other important thing is to teach them how to become their own teachers. Because, after college, most of us go on our way without regular lessons. You might still grab, coaching sessions in preparing for special events like a professional audition or something. But I think understanding how to problem solve and using their creativity to solve their own problems and provide them with enough of understanding about the basics of playing the horn, the basic truths about, how to, a system, if you will, of how to do the basic skills on the horn, that they can diagnose their own problems and figure out creative ways of solving those problems. So, becoming their own teachers ultimately, because it's what we all have to do eventually.
Wow, so in a way, making yourself obsolete.
Yeah, exactly. I ain't going to be around forever,
So I'm curious, do you follow the same curriculum for every student? Why or why not?
Well, I certainly don't, and I do think that, every students, especially coming out of high school, you start college, and at different levels. Everyone has different experiences, different strengths as players, and everyone has, an Achilles heel of an area that may be weaker than the rest of their abilities. So you kind of have to tailor-make a program for each student. At the same time, be careful. I think they all have to go through implementation of systems that, as I understand it, on the horn, so that everyone comes out at least with the same understanding. But as far as then where do you spend your time, it's going to depend on where the student's strengths and weaknesses lie. So, in short, it's not the same for every student, and then you take into account their personalities and how they learn. Because some students do well by imitation, but they're not very analytical, and some are just the opposite. That's where we talk about being the janitor with the many keys, or being able to switch many hats as a teacher to how you're going to get through to the student. So no two are alike, and that's one of the joys of hearing people play differently and just getting to know people, different personalities.
Well, yeah, that style of learning is so important, and I feel like I see that very easily in other people, but I've always struggled to find that in myself. And I remember one of those aha moments was actually here at the Brevard Music Center. Back in the day, I don't know if it still happens or not, but they would allow students to sit backstage. That might have been before they had a shell. Now that they have a shell, there might not be as much space. But yeah, they would let you come with your score, first horn part, second horn part, whatever, and you'd sit behind the section. And I remembered things clicked so much more naturally, weirdly, when I could watch somebody play. Like listening to a recording did a lot for me, but nowhere near as much as me listening and watching it happen, right in front of me.
Talk is cheap.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but there's nothing like hearing somebody do it.
Yeah.
It's like you don't need words then.
Yeah, for sure. So what is your take on equipment? Are you the kind of person that if you don't like the horn that someone's playing, you throw it against the wall? Or are you, are you happy to kind of let somebody sit on what they need to be on? And if you do recognize that someone needs a new instrument, what are the things that lead you to believe that? And how do you go about getting a new instrument or mouthpiece for a student?
Good questions, because we all face it at some point, Although I will say, I won my job with the New York Philharmonic with the Con 8D that my parents bought me in high school.
Wow.
Yeah. Never should have sold that horn, right? But I foolishly did. Well, I'm not an equipment junkie, but I will say this: it's a different time than when I grew up, but it exists still to some degree. When I grew up in New York, there was two fundamentally distinct schools of playing in the United States. There was the so-called Chicago School of Horn Playing, based in Chicago, and Chicago Symphony, and the equipment that went with it, concept of sound, and so forth. And then there was the New York-based school, which wasn't exclusive to New York, but it also came with its own standard-issued equipment. And I was part of that. And to this day, there are people who still hang on to those old divisions among schools of playing that oftentimes fall along the party lines of equipment. And I'm not interested in that anymore. I was dogmatic because I grew up in a school where standard issue was a Con 8D and a large mouthpiece. I still play a large mouthpiece. I don't play Con 8D anymore. Not that there's anything wrong with that. To me, it's about how you sound or how you play, not what you play. I find it sometimes disconcerting when it seems sometimes that people are judging people with their eyes more than their ears. If it's beautiful, I don't care what somebody's playing. And, we should all be striving for beauty in our playing, but what's beautiful changes with the repertoire, what's appropriate for Brahms versus, Mozart or Mahler or something, that's a different style and that we all have to reach for. So to me, equipment is important, and I try not to dictate the way somebody sounds. I could stick to my tried and true New York roots, and I do prefer, sort of a richer, fuller sound, not necessarily darker, which was kind of the way you would describe maybe the New York style of the pre-1990s or something. It is probably darker, but still to this day. But it's not about that. What it really is that as a teacher, you want a student to have as many possibilities of finding a place in this world, a job. Musically. And so the only time I will steer students is when I feel like they're too extreme. If their style and their approach to playing isn't really going to fit in many places. And they're going to limit their options professionally. And that's almost like a self-imposed recipe for a lack of success, for failure. And I sort of don't want to see somebody frustrate and limit their options. So I try to steer people towards the middle of the road. It could be on the brighter side, it could be on the darker side, it could be a little more focused and lighter, it could be a little bit heavier. But too much in any direction nowadays it would be maybe a non-starter at an audition when you're amongst a field of many candidates at an audition. Yes, the world has become more generic stylistically, which might be a harsh way of saying it, but what I like to believe and what I aspire to, and I hope horn players of the future will aspire to, is finding equipment that allows them to imitate the more defined schools of the past that have broken down a little bit. So that, for example, if you're playing French repertoire, the French Impressionists, you should listen to those orchestras of old, Boston Symphony in the 1950s, or go listen to French orchestras or the Swiss Romande Orchestra or something in their heyday, and hear the colors that probably the composers themselves heard that inspired them to write these pieces. And which, in my case, I'm not sure a big mouthpiece and a Con 8D would get me there. If I want to play lighter, I've got to find equipment that can get me there. I think today's players also, we have had much more rely on multifaceted careers. You might have an orchestra job, but there might be chamber music opportunities that come with that orchestra job, solo opportunities, and we're sort of expected to be able to do all those things. I might not be a full-time soloist, but I do get asked to play solos. So you have to rethink your equipment. So life is a compromise. So I find myself with principally one horn, one mouthpiece, but I have something else I can go to if I need something that's noticeably different. But I don't like to get hung up on equipment too much. And for the students, when I sense that their horn is not allowing them to get the results they want, the quality of the instrument perhaps, or they're seeking a different sound than what naturally seems to come out of this particular instrument. In other words, limiting the kind of sound that they can make. That's when we might have a conversation about trying different equipment. It could be mouthpiece change, it could be an instrument change. And then sometimes it's just for technical reasons too. A mouthpiece change might make their skills improve right away out of the box because maybe what they're playing really is a deterrent to mastering some of these skills. But I think when it comes to the artistry thing, again, I'd like people to consider first, how does it sound to you? And if it moves you, if it's beautiful, who cares what mouthpiece they play? And if I play the same mouthpiece, I'm not going to sound like that, most likely. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I want to go back to something that you hinted at earlier that I love. You were talking about, in a way, making it less about the equipment and more about the player and the beauty of the player and the characteristics of that player that they bring to the table. And the reason I love it is because I was having a full circle moment. I was remembering when Julie Lansman was talking about this exact subject, and the example that she brought up to sort of solidify a very similar opinion to what you're saying there is look at what we did at the Met when we hired Erik Ralske Roxy, and I think she said that you were on a Schmidt triple.
I was on a Schmidt triple.
Yeah, on a Schmidt triple. Like, we were a section of all 8D, players, and that's what we hired. It's a beautiful example of we hired a player, not equipment.
Yeah, and I always say, like, because I grew up playing Conite D, it's in my DNA. It is, there are qualities of that instrument that I've always strived to get out of any instrument I play. But a great example supporting this idea too was that in my later years at the Philharmonic, I was the associate principal, and Myers was away, I guess, and I played the whole program and changing in the dressing room afterwards. And Myron Bloom walks into the room. It's New York. You never know who's going to show up to your concerts. And I'd studied with Myron for, he was one of my horn heroes, and I had a summer with him in Aspen when I was a student. And he walks in and he says, "Erik, you sound great, beautiful as ever. You're still playing your Conite D, aren't you?" And he's in the audience, and I'm playing a Schmidt triple, and he doesn't know that I'm not playing my Conite D. He is like the quintessential diehard, 8D true believer. And if he couldn't tell, again, it comes down to how you play, not what you play. Mm-hmm. And if I can fool, an expert, a connoisseur of 8Ds like that, I think that it just proves my point. It's how you play, not what you play.
Of course. What are your thoughts on transposing? I love to ask this question because I think it's always really interesting for the student audience to get to hear the answers to this question specifically. Because I think if we took a poll, you put 100 different types of horn players in the same room, I think you get a huge variety of answer. Half the people saying, there's no point. Why can't we just all read off F parts? And another diehard crowd saying, absolutely not. Yeah. So I'm curious to know, where do you stand on this argument? Should we all just read off of F parts?
Well, it certainly in some ways make life a lot easier, because I'm the guy sitting there playing sometimes long operas, you're 4 or 5 hours in, and in operas we see some of the strangest transposition keys ever. Actually, the opera Carmen, something as standard as Carmen, between the 4 horn parts, but almost every part covers all 12 tone transpositions. I mean, if you take, like I said, horns 1 through 4 and look at all the different keys that he writes the horn parts in, you get everything. Things like horn in G flat you don't see in symphonic repertoire, which isn't that hard, but if you don't see it, and you're tired. That's not that long on opera either, but still, you know what I mean? It's your brain's having to work overtime. Or there's also this, some D flat horn, which you don't see, and it's just like, and if it's chromatic, it's really hard. I wish there were times like that when there were F horn parts available just for those moments. But at the same time, it's really nice to have the connection to our roots, the natural horn. So it would be weird to see some things written out in F when clearly it was written for natural horn. But those pieces are pretty easy to transpose because they're not very chromatic. But I think my least favorite thing is, well, I have several. Before I entered the world of opera, my least favorite thing was like D horn that was very chromatic. And you see even in Dvorak, think about third horn, the Seventh Symphony, it's like pretty chromatic, and you're in D horn. And I also think there's a couple of pieces by Strauss which have D horn, and how chromatic Strauss gets. It's just, I can't, my brain doesn't work like that. I can't sight read it. The end of Rosenkavalier, it's sort of a Mount Everest piece for horn. The writing is so challenging, but it's also long, and you're on, full throttle to 4.5 hours. You get to the last 2 pages, 3 pages of it. There's like horn in A flat basso, and just uncomfortably the last page, things in G horn that, G horn, we see it often enough, but it would look so much easier to play if you just didn't have that barrier of having to transpose it and play it and be mentally and physically fatigued by that point.
And do it night after night after night.
Yeah. So not a clear-cut answer. Maybe I would leave it as leave the stuff for natural horn the way it always has been. But, as soon as you get into, the mid-19th century where composers are getting much more chromatic, and, you have Brahms, but Brahms gets pretty chromatic too, and he's writing for a natural horn still. I might start thinking about
maybe at Brahms
drawing the line somewhere there. Yeah.
So a little A, a little B.
Yeah,
based on logic. For this next question, Be honest. Do you regularly attend your students' performances? And do your students often attend your performances?
Happy to say, yeah, as much as possible, yes, to both questions. I think it's really important to go hear your students perform, to hear them in lesson, one-on-one, and no audience really, other than me being the audience, I guess, in their lessons. It's interesting to see them as performers. It's ultimately where they're going to make their lives. So to see what they do in concert is great. And last year there was a Schumann Concertstück competition at school. Actually, Paige was winner as first horn of that quartet. But, it was a thrill to hear them play it. I'd coached them on it, and they came and they brought their game to it, and it was a great performance. But also just sometimes catching the orchestra concerts, and thank God, actually, things do get streamed often at Juilliard. So if I can't be there in person, I can catch it streamed later. That's the only thing it's my own schedule and performance schedule at the Met that precludes me going to everything. But I always go to their senior recitals, and we always work it out that they schedule it at a time where I know I'm going to be free and there's no performance conflict for me, because that's great. That's the pinnacle of their time at school, their graduation recitals, and I get to meet families, which is great and fun, and celebrate their achievement and just before they graduate. I also occasionally do at Juilliard side-by-side rehearsals. They'll hire faculty sometimes to sit in and coach the horn section at the back of the orchestra for something that I might be preparing for whatever reason, and that's also an opportunity to sort of, again, see your students in action. So it's really important. And they do come to the Met. I can get generally free tickets to open dress rehearsals, and whoever can come comes. Not mandatory, but I'm happy to see that they enjoy opera in the way I probably didn't when I was their age, but I just really wasn't exposed to it. So that's great to see them come. And through Juilliard, they can get a deal on tickets if they want to purchase, as most of the theaters actually do in New York, Carnegie and Geffen Hall, if there's student discount prices and ways for students to make tickets available that are affordable for students. So that's how they get to hear us, the professionals.
So it's awesome that there are all those opportunities. I remember taking advantage of many of those when I was a student, got to see some phenomenal performances. Even when it was, I was signing up for things and I didn't even know what they were. I mean, acting shows around town, off-Broadway shows and stuff. Juilliard gets all kinds of random stuff, you almost want to call it, and they'll send out an email and say, hey, we got 50 tickets to this thing, who wants to go? And the first thing that I went to when I was a student was an off-Broadway show, and it was phenomenal. I was like, wow, I can't believe this is just a thing I get to do now.
Yeah, it's so great that a lot of institutions will just, if they want to paper the audience, so to speak, offer it up to students through Juilliard. Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to pivot to college auditions. Let's say there's a listener that's feeling like, I really, really like this guy. I want to study with Erik. Juilliard has been one of my dream schools since I was a little boy, a little girl. Can you tell them a little bit about what auditions are like at Juilliard, and what qualities do you like to hear from a player in those auditions?
Well, I think it's important for students to realize that at every audition, really, the people on the other side, we're not ogres. We're pulling for people to do their best. We really want to hear everyone playing at their best, and that you're picking the best of the best at their best. You can feel like, we have to eliminate all these people who didn't do well and who's left standing, but that's kind of like coming from a negative. It's much better to see people just not crumbling under the pressure of it. And I can attest to the fact that Jen and Erik are really nice people.
Oh, yes.
And they're really sweet. And so we really just want to make people feel at ease. So I think it might just take some of the pressure off for the incoming students to recognize that. But it's even true of professional auditions, that it's not fun to hear someone maybe get nervous and not play their best. It's really kind of a sad thing, because we've all been there. So
have we ever?
Yeah, but what I look for at auditions for school, at the high school level, it's different than if someone's applying for a master's degree. Naturally, the bar goes up. But I would say the students need to remember this, as much as we, the faculty, are all aware of, that if a person comes in and played perfectly, they wouldn't need to be a student anymore. You're auditioning to be a student, and that means you've still got stuff to learn. So understand the fact that it's not going to be a perfect audition. You just have to be the best you can be. That, by definition, is success. And then leave it to us to then make our choices to see how competitive you at your best is. But bear in mind that, again, everyone has their strengths and everyone has the areas that maybe need more attention, need more time to develop, etc. So that's just something that's going to be part of the audition. It will reveal itself, and there's not to feel bad about it. I know for me personally, when I become aware this person does this and this and this well, and they seem to, maybe they're going to need some attention over these next 4 years on this area. At that point, that's kind of, everyone sort of fits into that category, and then it's up to me to figure out, do I personally feel like that's something I can really help them with? Is it my strength? Somebody else on faculty might feel like it is their strength, and I might feel like I'm not as much in my wheelhouse, perhaps, and so they may end up in that person's studio, for example, because we always have a conversation afterwards. We work as a team. It's great. But what I specifically look for, essentially, and this is important to remember for high school students, is that we're just kicking the tires. It's not going to be a perfect audition. We hope that you play your best. But to me, we break down horn playing into 6 fundamentals. I'm assuming first beauty of sound, because why else play the horn? But if you have a fundamentally beautiful sound, and it's under control through the range of stuff you play, the question of the skills comes down to, can you play high, can you play low, can you play loud, can you play soft, can you articulate well, and can you play legato? Those 6 things. And it's always going to improve, hopefully, for the rest of one's horn playing days. At least I'm still telling myself that about my own playing. But is it at a good level for whatever age your level and level of college you're auditioning for? And, hopefully the weaknesses don't show up as such a deficit. Then, again, you get to spend, hopefully, the years that you'll be in school working at those things to bring everything up to the highest possible level. But it is fundamentally that. And, of course, you want to hear somebody who believes in their own musical ideas, so it's got to be expressive, too. If you just reduce horn playing down to a checklist of skills, it sort of takes the personal aspect out of it. What makes it special is the person behind the instrument and what they have to say about the music connecting to it. So that's an understood too. That's something that should be there at every audition. And let the mistakes be where they fall, but make music first and foremost, and then show off your skills as best as you can.
Wow, some incredible advice in there. One thing I latched onto was just a little bit that you said about how students are divided into certain studios. That's sort of something that I never thought about. Because I think a lot of times when you go to a school with multiple teachers, you have the opportunity to fill out a request card. But at Juilliard, you're saying that maybe it's more likely that we divvy up who students are studying with based on what you feel is the best match, perhaps based on the student's strengths or weaknesses.
Well, a little correction. I mean, the students still to this day have a chance to express who their first, second, third choices are to study with. But someone else on faculty might be more attracted to somebody's playing than I might be if I'm turned off by something that I feel needs work and might not be, as interesting or as much maybe my strength as a teacher to work with. They might be better suited to somebody else there. And that's where, when we have our conversations, we only sort of decide collectively who we're recommending be accepted. The scores and the comments will stand for themselves. They get processed by the admissions office. But we do as a team try to, make sure that if someone really expresses a strong interest in working with somebody, and I don't maybe feel as strongly about them as someone else that interests me, I think that there's a place for that person who, with Erik or Jen, might really feel, I would look forward to working with this person because they see something or hear something that maybe I didn't, or that they know that the fix that this person needs is something that can be done very quickly in their, more in their wheelhouse perhaps, let's say, and then it may just ends up being a better match. So you might end up in that case with your second choice for teacher or something. It just depends. But it should be the right fix. And like I said, today's Juilliard, there's a chance to pick everybody's brains on faculty, to get some time one-on-one with each of us if there's that need, which is great. I sometimes do feel jealous of schools where there's a full-time faculty person with their own studio with all their materials in there, with office hours, and the students can access them and those materials on a regular basis, and that you might see your teacher more than just that 1 hour a week for a lesson. I do envy that situation, that those teachers have the chance to really be there more 24/7. Not 24/7, but you know what I mean. Much more opportunities to work with students other than just the formality of the regular lesson time. But I think what we can offer up at Juilliard that's a little bit different is this sort of loosely structured team feeling that you've got 3 teachers who care about you and are invested in all of our students at Juilliard and not just the ones in my studio.
Wow, and all 3 are a
changed.
resource that you can access. It's amazing. The next question is in the same vein as our previous one. If there's a student out there who says, okay, I'm going to Juilliard, or I want to go to any school really for performance, is there a specific subject or aspect of playing that you feel like your incoming freshmen are most deficient in? This might give them a chance to get a leg up on the competition before they go off to school.
Yeah, it's true. I think that the most common thing I see, it's almost like a natural evolution for playing, because most of the stuff that we audition on materials, and when it comes to solos, and you start learning concertos when you're studying horn in high school, they sit above middle C. They rarely dip below middle C. So the low register is really, I think by the time most high school students graduate high school, they've spent 80% of their time playing the horn above middle C and probably only 20% of the time below middle C. I know that was the case for me, but I hear that you don't have many high school students, auditioning on Bach cello suites or the Neuling Bagatelle or something like that. It's that required Mozart 2 or 4, Strauss 1, and you can count on one hand the number of notes probably that are below middle C on those 3 major concerti. So I think low register ends up being something that most students have to delve into in college, some of them become extraordinary low horn players too. I find that they have a real gift for it. But that's one thing I find is that everyone wants to play first horn. Everyone's a star in their local community. They probably get put on the first horn chair, and maybe you don't have a lot of 10th graders saying, I want to grow up and be the 4th horn of the Berlin Philharmonic. Maybe that's true.
I think a lot of people want to be Sarah Willis, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably changed. I should have used a different register as an example. But, but so many people do want to play the great moments for first horn, in an orchestra, and I think that's where the emphasis is sort of high horn heavy. But thanks to people like Sarah Willis and many other, outstanding low horn
Denise
players
Trine's
these
another
days.
one. That's just
it's changed another world.
Her,
And thankfully, those people have provided repertoire that didn't exist before too, inspired people to write pieces that feature the low end of the horn, challenge us, and play as expressively, in that register. What we used to just think is like filling out the harmony kind of notes, and not something that could be both easy sounding technically or expressively, in that register. So, it's a different world. But I do think probably that's one of the most common things. And the other thing that high school players sometimes are deficient on is developing the kind of sense of really reliable subdivision and strength of individual mastery of rhythm. I think that comes...
so difficult.
Yeah.
So difficult. That's such a journey of maturity, I think is maybe what I would call it, and a limitless possibility because you're aiming for perfection, and it's so difficult to detect internally, but so easy to understand when you're listening.
Yeah. It's
really tough one.
Yeah, it's just a maturing process, and that's why, we all students have to be patient, and like I said, you're auditioning to be a student, to learn more.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about student health. I think as every horn player knows, professional horn players especially, it is no walk in the park to this journey to becoming a professional musician, really on any instrument. I'd be curious to know, how do you help your students manage the inevitable stress and uncertainty they will face while trying to earn a career in music?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In fact, just before this interview, I got a phone call from one of my students in Aspen who's just, she's feels like she's overplaying and her chops are hurting and, what do I do? I got more stuff to play, And so, yeah, I think that there's the physical stress, taking care of one's health, one's chops, you want to use them for life. You got to be smart about that. And that comes to knowing, as musicians, sometimes we feel like we always have to practice when we encounter problems, and sometimes the answer isn't to practice, but it's to rest. that you've maybe overextended those small, delicate muscles, and they just need time to reset. So time off can be the best cure sometimes. Then there's the mental stress, and it's real, and we all go through it. And performance anxiety is something everybody deals with, and everybody gets nervous. People who say they don't are lying. Sometimes
Agreed.
situations that make you more nervous, and some that you make me feel more calm, less nervous. But this, as soon as there's an audience there, most of us elevate our heartbeat, might go up, or adrenaline levels. So yeah, I talk, of course, a lot about performance anxiety, because it seems like students are eternally always preparing for auditions and of course concerts too. And then Juilliard's resources, we talked about Noah Kageyama and his performance psychologist and his classes that he does. That's also a resource for students. But in my own lessons, I talk about my own experiences. I've been through many auditions. I've had, fortunately, many successes, but I think it's about a third of the time I would win, 2/3 of the time I lost auditions. And the process of learning how to do one's best when one's nervous. And there's probably nothing more nerve-wracking than an audition, because you're just naked on stage and they're putting you through every pace they can. So my best advice is quite simply is to try to be here now. I always say 90% of life is just showing up. What's behind that mantra of mine is that expectations is probably what sets us off. So we talk about mental discipline, because if your mind isn't, if you don't have the discipline to focus on what's happening right here, right now, of course, in a performance, it's the fear of the future. You might go badly. And that's a distracting thought. And you've just got to find a way of, it's like standing on the head of a pin, of just living in this moment right here. And this moment, that's gone already. So how do you stay focused? We talk about the many different techniques to develop that ability to block out the many layers that our mind functions on, the multitasking things that are caught up in the future, perhaps, or the past, and anything but what's going on here, right now. So that's part of it too. And then I try to sometimes talk them down, and if they're really uptight going into situations, to remind them it's 10 minutes of your life, and you're the only thing that you can control. You cannot control who else shows up. You cannot control the acoustics of the room you're going to play in. I think the best advice is also to remember what got you into music, and it's your love of music, and it's your passion for it. So when you go there, make music, and stop thinking about if you can play, but how do you want to play? And how you want to play is to sing your song. And then those darker moments where you're just thinking about not screwing up, that's such a defensive posture. And if you can think about a much more positive way of looking at this 8-measure solo that's 20 bars away, it's like embrace it as an opportunity to show people how you feel about this music. So some of the things we talk about a lot.
Yeah, a tremendous amount of advice in that. It's such a complicated subject. And it's as complicated as humans are complex, I think, for sure. And it's so difficult for, I think, any other human to tell you exactly what you need in order to resolve that anxiety and that stress around, performance. Yeah. But yeah, certainly having a teacher who lives it day in and day out has got to be the best thing one can do to help guide you to your own sort of solution with those really complex problems.
Well, we owe it, for those of us who have been through it, to pass on those things that helped us. So yeah, goes back to that question of why we teach.
Yes. So you talked a little bit earlier about how sometimes the solution to a problem involves playing, and other times it involves sort of not playing. So I'm curious to know, in that time that you're referring to where we're not playing, do you encourage your students to engage in other interests outside of music?
Absolutely, yeah. Of course, I'm really gung-ho about the program at Juilliard, but I also feel that one of the things that's important for all musicians is to spend time in a city like New York. I mean, it doesn't have to be New York, but New York is, like in the United States, unlike no other in terms of it being such a capital, world international capital of classical music. So Yeah, I mean, there's so much to feed one's creative soul, and it doesn't have to be music. The great museums and the other performing arts that are there for the taking in New York City, and it's inspiring in that way. I think the creative mind needs to be fed, can't live in a vacuum. So to have those experiences and find inspiration in other art forms, as well as just for that, we were just talking about stress a moment ago too. It's like, can't be music and horn nonstop 24/7, you know? And I think that to get out and enjoy what a city like New York has to offer can be a release of that stress, to just get away from it, to put it aside, come back and deal with it when you're ready to work again. So everyone needs playtime too.
There's something that you hinted at earlier, but with your student that called you before the interview today, but I want to ask it outright. Do you have any thoughts on or experience with playing injuries, and how do you guide your students to recovery?
Yeah, I've been quite lucky, I think. We don't generally have a lot of control over our own schedules in professional life. You've got a job, the schedule gets set, the repertoire gets set. And I know there have been times where I have felt like my chops had taken a beating. They're not nice and supple, like any muscle. They can get stiff. So you just have to be very careful about it. And I think that, I'll offer this specific, I think, but very common problem for horn players is that these small muscles, like any other muscles, when they take a beating, might become inflamed and they get a little puffy, right? Well, if you have X amount of lip in the mouthpiece when you're healthy, and now they're blown up like balloons, it may be that inside the mouthpiece you might feel you got as much lip as you've ever had, but if those lips are inflamed, you might end up slightly altering your embouchure or where the place where the mouthpiece goes, because after a few days of easier playing, suddenly the inflammation goes, and the thing to be, I think, on the lookout for is that in that recovery period, when the swelling has disappeared, has your aperture opened up too far? Because previously there was a lot of puffy flesh inside the mouthpiece, and you put the rim where it goes on the outside of your lips, and now there's less flesh inside the mouthpiece, and I think that's a very common problem, and that's where suddenly it's like, my high register's not as good as it used to be, or just struggling a little bit more. It doesn't feel right. And invariably, I think it's just your lips end up too far apart. And I think that's a really common thing. I've seen it in my own playing, and I've seen it among some well-known players, not just on horn, brass players who've just same thing. So know when to rest and embrace it. Don't feel guilty if you're not practicing one day. The rest may be more valuable to you. And if you need to practice without the instrument. Study that score, study that recording, and not have to put the mouthpiece to your face and still feel like you're more prepared for that rehearsal, that concert.
Solid advice. So we have our last couple of questions coming up here, and they really get at the heart of who you are as a teacher. If every student could only learn one thing from you, what would you want it to be?
Wow. Big question. Only get one thing, right?
One thing. That's the challenge. You got to pick one.
I think that, it's such an honor and such a privilege to do what we do professionally, and to never forget that, because with that comes a responsibility, a responsibility to the music, a responsibility to ourselves to deliver that music, a responsibility to our colleagues to recognize we're part of the same team and to put any personal differences aside and to be a great team, to function and work together towards the same goal. It's all wrapped up in the idea of the honor and the privilege to do what we do, because what we do is essential, it's our job to bring some beauty into this world for as long as we can do it, because we're only here for a limited time, to make the most of that. And it's really a career about giving, and I think that makes life all the more rich, the more you give. It can't be a selfish act. It should be selfless, I think.
Lovely. Last one. Is there anything you typically say to those graduating from your studio before they leave?
The best advice I can give somebody is to remind them to never forget or lose sight of the passion that they have for what they're doing. Throughout life, and certainly one's professional life too, there are darker times and happier times. And the thing that always carries you through is what got you into this business in the first place is your passion for music and the horn. And if you lose sight of it, then it's just a job in the worst sense of the world. And you've lost the love of it. When you pick up your instrument, it should still be an act of love. And so I think that's what I would say to anybody who's going on to their career, because that'll be your best friend, and that'll always carry you and remain true to your art.
Beautiful. So let's say one of our listeners has absolutely loved this interview, and they have a question about something you said, or perhaps a question about Juilliard. What would be the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Well, you can always write to me through Juilliard. I think, online my email address is there. And I'm always happy to, when I can, to answer text messages or emails to answer those questions. Many students, when they're making the rounds and considering schools and teachers, might visit the school in advance of the audition and arrange for a lesson while they're in New York. Or nowadays, thanks to COVID, we've gotten all very proficient about Zoom lessons. So, I try to entertain those, schedule allowing. But that's always nice because no one has to commute and there's no plane tickets involved. So that's always another way of doing it. And invariably, too, we always host before the audition week at Juilliard, which is usually late February, early March. We'll host an online session with the 3 faculty members and some monthly admissions, and students can sign up and take part in like a Zoom conversation and fire away questions at us about the school and each of our studios and our approach to playing, whatever. So that's always a nice thing too, because the information's fresh going into the audition and impressions of meeting us and all that stuff too. And so it's a nice way of making ourselves accessible to everyone who's applying.
Erik, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to interview you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's such a pleasure meeting you, Andrew, really. And I'm so pleased for Paige, who's going to join you in the orchestra next year, because she's got a great colleague here. And I look forward to hearing more from this series, because it's a tremendous resource for students who are looking for where they want to spend their college careers.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right.
Bravo. Nicely done.